Hello and welcome to this revision video for the People's Health GCSE units. This video is going to focus on living conditions. Now, if you get a question that asks about living conditions, write down on the exam paper the 4 key things you're going to talk about, because it's really important you focus all of your energy when thinking about living conditions into these 4 things. We are talking about housing. Where have people lived? As we go through this course from medieval times up to the present, we're talking about food. What food have people eaten? How has that helped their health? How has it challenged them living a healthy lifestyle? What about the water? Where have people tried to get clean water to drink? And finally, how have people got rid of waste? Not just human waste, although that's an important part of it, also literally just the rubbish that accumulates in life. So what you need to be thinking about is, do you know about each of these 4 things for the 4 eras of our course? And also, are you able to think about how they've changed over time, why they've changed over time? Finally, it's important that you have some thoughts, some analysis of ways that things have been different for different groups of people, whether that's rich and poor, people living in towns and cities. Okay, so this video is going to run through some of the major points for each of the different eras, and we'll start with medieval Britain. Now, when you think about medieval Britain, it's useful to have a kind of image in your head. I think of something that looks a bit like this. And the major point is that 90% of the population in this era are poor peasants. They're living in the countryside. So when we are thinking about their living conditions, we are thinking about these kinds of people. They live a pretty tough life. They do their best, of course, to make it as good as possible. It's just what they know. But life isn't easy for them. Let's think a bit about why. First of all, in terms of housing, well, peasants are going to live in either a kind of simple stick and mud hut or a larger timber-framed house. As time moves through medieval era, and also for the most people, better off peasants, they're going to live in houses that look a bit like this. Okay, so timber, wooden frames, and relatively spacious. Now, inside these houses are a bunch of health hazards. We can think about open fires, bringing smoke into their house. We can think about there being animals inside. And each of those and various other things you can see in this picture are going to cause germs to spread, are going to make it difficult to kind of stay healthy, and people are going to share the space. Quite a lot of people sharing the same space. If we think about food, well, for most people, for these peasants that we're talking about, their life relies on a good harvest. How much food can they collect from the farming of that year? When harvests are good, then life is basically fine. You get enough food to live relatively healthily. However, if there's disease, for example, ergotism, or there's bad weather, this can lead to famine. This can literally lead to people dying because there's not enough food to eat. And the most famous, the most significant example is the 1315 Great Famine, in which 10% of the population died. And that just reminds us of how peasants' lives at this time were challenging if anything went wrong, precarious lifestyle. Having said that, important that we remember that it's not all bad. So actually, in good times, in good harvests, people are eating pretty healthy diets. They're eating vegetables, fruits, nuts. They're eating some milk, eggs, cheese. Many peasants would have their own animals. And those staples of bread and pottage, which we might not necessarily like to eat all the time ourselves in terms of pottage, but it's a healthy meal, vegetable, grainy stew. So actually people have relatively good diets. Always important to compare different groups of people. So rich people, of course, are going to have more food. It's more likely to be richer, more meat and fish, and they're going to have a healthier diet because of that, a wider range of nutrients and a more reliable source of food. In terms of water, in the countryside, you're relying on either water from a stream or a spring. Fresh spring water is going to be safer, more reliable, reliably cleaner. Streams might be dirty through making clothes or through animals being in them. In towns, you get water from a conduit, which is a pipe bringing spring water straight into a kind of fountain, or you might buy water from a water carrier that's got the water from a conduit and then walk around the town with it. Or richer people might have wells in their own houses. So there's a picture of a conduit to give you an idea. There is a man with a well. Important to remember also at this time that in the countryside and in towns, rich and poor drink quite a lot of ale, a low alcoholic drink, and the process of making that removes most, if not all, of the dangerous germs that might be in water. Finally, then, let's think about waste. So, in medieval times, in the countryside, for getting rid of waste, you're going to use a midden, a rubbish pile that might be in a garden, might be nearby to where people are living, and you're going to use some sort of cesspit, some sort of hole dug in the ground for human waste. That might be a tiny, small hole in a wood, or it might be a larger one that multiple people share. Not the cleanest or safest ways to deal with waste. In towns, you have public latrines and cesspits, so quite often these are going to be things that lots of people are sharing. The cesspits that collect the waste underground aren't always going to be particularly well built. And then you have people that come to collect it. Gong firmers are collecting the human waste, and rakers are more like street cleaners, like this guy. So these are the various ways that people get rid of waste. Worth remembering that most of this waste will end up on fields as fertilizer. Doesn't sound very nice. Actually, it's not particularly dangerous if done right, but there are some potential things that can go wrong there. And of course, that would lead to a whole bunch of health issues. So those are the main factors in terms of medieval Britain. Just quickly, let's think about life in towns, because although it's a small group of people in terms of percentage-wise, it's important we're able to talk about what life was like in towns. So we need to remember that marketplaces are the centre of these towns. They are full of stalls, particularly on market days, animals there, lots of different people. They are places where diseases and dirt is going to spread quite quickly. Animals around, flies, fleas, not easy to clean marketplaces. Much harder to get rid of waste in a town if you've got so many people around. That's easier in a small village or a collection of houses in the countryside. So it's harder to get rid of waste, and that waste might often end up in a river or local water system. Housing might be cramped together, particularly in poorer neighborhoods. And there's going to be a bunch of trades. People making paint or making anything that people need is going to create smoke, going to create pollution, which wasn't great for people living nearby. Okay, let's move on to early modern Britain then, so our second major era. That's really important that you're able to think about what is changing, what's staying the same. And in terms of early modern Britain, well, the headline is that not that much is changing. If we think about most people, well, 80% still live in the countryside, and their lives actually aren't that different to the people that came before them, their ancestors. Most people in the countryside, most peasants are eating the same kind of food, they're living in similar kind of houses, they're getting their water from similar places, they're getting rid of their waste in similar ways. So we could think as our headline that actually not that much changes for most people. One significant change, though, is that improvements in farming mean that famine becomes a thing of the past. So there is better production of food, more reliable, and that's going to help ensure people's health. What does change, though? Well, important for us to think about towns which are growing, and with that come new challenges to people's health. And also for richer people. This is where we see the most significant, the biggest changes in early modern Britain. And a lot of that has to do with trade, which brings in new products, whether those are healthy and positive for people, new fruits and vegetables, or, of course, sugar, which becomes a real issue. And we see a whole bunch of obesity, tooth decay, and a real unbalanced diet for many wealthier people at this time. So in these towns, as they grow, these are going to increase the potential health hazards. The more people in a smaller place, that's going to make everything from getting water to getting rid of waste a lot more challenging. The markets we talked about in medieval Britain remain, and as they get bigger, more people around, they remain somewhere which is hard to keep clean, somewhere which is a source of germs and diseases. With more people around, there's more dust, there's more soot, more smoke. That's creating respiratory diseases. It's not easy to ventilate the kind of houses which people are living in. And particularly for poorer people in towns, houses are likely to be cramped and damp and cold, particularly in winter. not particularly healthy places to live, and places where you're going to get germs, you get rats and mice, insects, that kind of thing. Over time in the early modern period, we see wooden houses largely being replaced with stone buildings in towns, and particularly the bigger cities see this throughout this era. That's going to help with keeping healthy and clean. In terms of water, not much is changing for most people. So conduits and water cellars remain the most common ways to get water in towns. The big thing that is changing, though, is the increasing number of water pipes which are taking water straight into people's homes. An example of that, in 1609, in just 1 year, London houses, 30,000 of them, get new water pipes going into them. And for those people that can get that, most of that water is coming from springs and from reliable sources. So this is a positive change. Again, that's mostly impacting richer people. And if we think about water, richer people are able to benefit from a number of things. First of all, they have servants that might wash their clothes. They've got more clothes to wash to kind of keep clean anyway. They are able to afford soap and have baths inside to keep clean. And also they're going to be able to pay for the kind of water pipes which we've just been talking about. Those kind of water pipes are not being done by a national government or a local government for all of the people. Let's just touch on waste quickly. This is something which, as there are more people in towns, it does become harder to get rid of because there's just more of it. However, at the same time, there is improved technology and better organisation. So there's more scavengers and rakers to come and take rubbish away from streets. The towns are better organised for that. We have better built cesspits like the picture we see here. And also people are building their own privies or jakes. This might help them not have to share with multiple people in terms of a kind of public cesspit. The flip side of that, though, is these privies and jakes might go straight into water. So jakes might be built right over a water source. And so as people try to get rid of this waste, it is going to contaminate and make things dirtier. Let's move on to our third period, the industrial era. And this is a really important moment where things change rapidly, significantly, and for most people, it changes for the worst. So things actually get a lot worse for most people. This would be the time where I would least like to be living in terms of living conditions. And the main driving factor of that is that in this era, the population of towns and cities absolutely explodes. So from 20% of the population living in a town and city at the beginning of this era in 1750, that goes up to 85% by the end of it. This is at a time where the actual overall population is growing as well. So there are just hundreds of thousands of people in these new industrial towns and cities, and there isn't the infrastructure there. There isn't the housing, there's not enough ways to get rid of waste, there's no ways to get clean water to all these people. And life gets really difficult, particularly for the poorest people working in factories, for the working classes. And a good little case study to try and think about, to try and remember here, we can think about the example of Manchester, where we have some data from 1841. And there the life expectancy, how old you were expected to live to at birth, would be 26.6 years. If we look at in the most kind of deprived areas, some of the working class areas, over half of children died before they were 5 years old. And that is due to just how difficult living conditions were, which then combined with epidemics which spread through industrial towns and cities. Let's think about some of the specifics then. So if we think about housing in industrial towns and cities, we think about three main housing options. We have back-to-backs. So these are big courtyards where people are sharing houses, essentially sharing walls in a building. They're not great for ventilation. Many of them aren't very well built. They're unlikely to have any water systems or to have private toilets. So whole courtyards are going to share privies and cesspits. So not particularly healthy. Much worse, though, are the cellars, which are underneath the back-to-backs or underneath other buildings. This is for the poorest people, people that might have just moved into a town or city, for example, or are really down and out. And those cellars are damp, dirty, they're hard to clean, and full of hazardous things. And then we have lodging houses, places where people might live in a kind of a hotel, a big shared room normally with people you don't know. This is going to be people that come into towns and don't have anywhere else to go. Again, all of these places, all of these types of housing are not easy to keep clean. They're going to be full of germs, lots of people, overcrowded, not very well built. They're cold, they're damp, and that is not good for people's health. Why is housing such an issue? Two main things. I mean, first of all, we need to just remember that there's so many people coming into towns and cities so quickly that there just isn't enough houses. People can't keep up. They can't build enough houses, at least good quality houses that keep up with the demand. And then if we tie that in with a desire for many people just to make money quickly out of this, so landlords, builders, even local politicians sometimes see opportunities to make huge amounts of money by building quick houses, and there's no regulations to make sure they are built well. They know, these people, that there's always going to be a demand for their houses. So all these things combine to make housing a real challenge. Food, again, is a massive problem, and we see a real crisis with malnutrition. People in these towns and cities not getting enough nutrients, not getting the right kind of diet to stay healthy. And if you're suffering from malnutrition, your body is not able to deal with some just quite regular germs that might be spreading around. You don't have that defense system. Malnutrition is being caused by basically not eating enough fruits and vegetables, not eating enough fresh food. People's diets this time are likely to have been dominated by just bread, potatoes, butter, maybe some cheap bacon. In themselves, not necessarily that bad, but if you're not eating anything else, then it's going to limit the effectiveness of the diet. And put on top of that a problem with adulteration, where the food that you're buying, you're not sure, you can never trust exactly what it is, and also you can't really trust the quality of it. So in these towns and cities, it is difficult, it's challenging to buy the food that you need to keep you healthy. Water is another challenge with all these people. How are they going to get water and safe, clean water in there? No longer are the conduits or water cellars going to be adequate. So we see water pumps appearing all over these cities. They're shared by many people. This is where most people would have gone to get their water. And the water companies that provide the water, as well as the landlords that pay for them, are really unreliable. So the water might only be available for 1 or 2 hours a day. The water might come from a contaminated source if the water company is a bit dodgy, just taking it from a river or a pond, for example. And so this is going to create a whole bunch of problems. Waterborne diseases, for example, typhoid and of course cholera, become widespread. And ultimately, people do not have a safe source of drinking water. Worth remembering and just thinking always, how do things change? So at the end of this era, things are starting to improve because of government action, because of improved technology. And eventually, towards the end of the industrial period, people are able to get water and starting to get into every household after the 1875 Public Health Act. Finally, then, for industrial Britain, let's think about waste. Now, all the things we've talked about so far were massive challenges for people, but waste was the biggest problem. You have all these people and just no clean, safe, well-built way to get rid of waste. And so this contaminates towns and cities. It creates terrible problems for people living there. How are people getting rid of waste? Well, people have privies. So these might be private or might be shared by a whole courtyard. This might empty into a kind of a hole underneath the ground, a kind of cesspit, or it might go into a bucket, which would then get put into a larger hole or get collected by a night watchman, night soilman, or a gong firmer. You're also going to have these larger cesspools. So night soilmen are going to come, collect that, and take it away. Not a particularly safe, secure system. For richer, upper class, middle class people, you do start to see flushing toilets, known as water closets at this time. This is good for them, but ultimately it's another problem because most often those flushing toilets just empty waste into the local river, and quite often that is a source of drinking water. So getting rid of waste, a massive, massive challenge. Things do start to change, so it's important just to keep that in mind. So when working class people are able to get the vote and the systems of government start to change and government changes its attitude, there are improvements. And also local communities do come together and really work hard to try and improve things for each other. So things like guilds, town committees, local groups do help to improve things over time. Okay, we'll move into our final era then. And having said at the start of the video that you're always going to think about those four main issues of food, housing, water, and waste, actually when we come to Britain since 1900, we don't really need to talk too much about water and waste because those things are problems of the past. They have been issues for people since medieval times and before that, but now for the first time, those two things do not create significant health problems. Most people have clean water coming into their houses, and most people have flushing toilets and sewer systems. Certainly, as we go through this era, that becomes true for everyone. So we're not going to talk too much about those things unless we're comparing with the previous era, in which case, of course, we're going to stress how significant it is that these things weren't problems anymore. Instead, there's two kind of newer things, newer problems and challenges with living conditions. The first is inactivity. People just aren't being active like they used to be, whether that's because of how they work, what they do in their free time, how people move around the place and transport themselves. People basically are much less active than they used to be. And a huge problem that's created is an issue with obesity. So currently in the UK, around 40% of the population is classified as overweight, and that is associated with a whole range of health problems. The other newer issue is air pollution. With the growth of cities, growth of pollution, that has really made the air in some cities at certain times really dangerous for people. And that becomes a new living condition which causes problems. If we think about smog, we need to remember this key example of in 1952, where around 12,000 people die in the winter there when there's a deadly smog which falls over London. The fumes, the smoke created from factories and from fireplaces gets kind of trapped, and that's toxic. It's very damaging for people. There were efforts to try to change things after this, so the government does step in, but more recently with an increase in car ownership, that has kind of replaced the problems that created the smog with new challenges. So car fumes, car exhausts release some really bad things into the air, some bad things for us to be breathing in, and at certain times that becomes worse, and that is an issue which towns and cities are still dealing with to this day. So those are the two kind of newer things we talk about. We're also going to go back to our classic food and housing to see how that is getting on. So in terms of food since 1900, well, science and technology have transformed the way we eat. A lot of this is being a positive. So through technology, with things like canning food, it's going to preserve it for a lot longer, keep it safer. Things like fridges, again, are going to keep food safer, cleaner for long. It's going to make things cheaper as well if you can store food like this safely. Transportation, meaning it's easier to get food from around the world, has meant that in Britain today, we eat food from, well, all around the world. And that means we can eat things which aren't typically grown in Britain at certain times of year. So even in wintertime, we can be eating fresh fruit from wherever it might be. And then factories have become places where food is produced, whereas it wasn't like that in previous eras. And this has made food a lot cheaper. Supermarkets alongside this have meant there's a wider range of food, a more reliable source of food, and this has real potential positives. Anyone in Britain can go into a supermarket and can buy food which is as healthy as anyone can eat, really. Sometimes that does bring with it extra costs, but we have the education, we have the knowledge of the food we need to eat, and we can access it. At the same time, though, supermarkets and some of the technology we've just been talking about has created junk food, processed food, which isn't good for people to eat in large volumes. And that, alongside inactivity, has created problems with people's health. Think about a few other issues to do with food. Well, in general, people have got richer, particularly since the 1950s. So people have had more money and prices of food has gone down. So that has helped people to be able to eat and buy enough food to keep them going. And like we just said, people have options. They do have the options to eat healthier food if they choose. The processed food, though, has brought new challenges, new problems, and there's a growing movement of people that are trying to avoid processed foods and new research going into how bad those can be sometimes for us. Mostly then we've thought about a positive picture, so food in general getting better and being a more positive story in the last 100 years. That's not to say there aren't still significant challenges. So whether that was the BSE crisis or whether it's these recent reports we can see here, something from the last 10 years of children at risk of getting rickets, which is a disease caused by a lack of nutrients, lack of certain vitamins. There are still problems in certain people, particularly some poorer communities, are not eating the diets, the foods which are important for our health. Finally, then we come on to housing. So the major changes with housing has seen old houses from industrial eras knocked down, things like back-to-backs, and replaced with newer buildings. Quite often we've seen skyscrapers and tall apartment buildings being constructed. A really important issue with housing is that the government has taken much more responsibility. In previous eras, from medieval, early modern industrial, it was a private kind of business where individuals were left up to themselves to try and work out housing. Here, though, in the 20th century, the government has taken a much wider responsibility, and part of that has been a kind of change of attitude, change of politics, but also after each of the world wars, there was this movement to think of we need to have homes for heroes. We need to have a country fit for the people that sacrificed or risked their lives for their country. And that gave impetus, inspiration to governments to try to improve the houses that the population lived in. One thing that's happened a lot is these kind of tower blocks that have been built. So by 1980, there'd been 4,500 tower blocks built. And this created healthy, clean, safe houses for people to live in, but there were some challenges with it in terms of sense of community, in terms of how people felt in these houses, and sometimes the issues with outside space, that sort of thing. The final key point in terms of housing, and to wrap up this video, is this idea of who has been in control of housing: individual landlords or councils, governments, authorities. So we can see here a really stark difference between the numbers of people that were living in council housing at the start of the era, as then we go through to the 1970s. There was a huge growth, way more people living in houses which were supported or controlled by councils. And in general, that can be seen as a positive thing. The councils take care over the houses, they have responsibility. It's easier to raise complaints or if you need things changed with a council than it is with an individual landlord. And they provided more reliable housing for people, particularly those perhaps more in need. If we look at some of the biggest changes then, at the start of the era, there's more private landlords. Then after the Government Housing Act of 1919, which comes straight after World War I, more council houses are built. And through the next 50 years, there are slum clearances. Many people don't like that word, but the clearances of older, less well-built houses, this idea of homes for heroes, and a whole bunch of council housing built across Britain. In the 1970s, though, right at the end, Margaret Thatcher becomes the Prime Minister, and she leads a new kind of idea, I suppose, about housing, where she believes that people should be able to own their own houses, not rely on council housing. And so what that means is that private landlords tended to take over large numbers of council houses after the 1980 Housing Act. And this was really positive for many people. They were able to own their own homes, but people that ended up living or renting houses from private landlords often found challenges that were harder to get fixed than they might have previously been done when you might go to a council to sort something out. And lots of private houses, private kind of landlords in their houses, they didn't keep up to the standards that were set out for what houses should be like. So there we have it. We've looked through these 4 different eras from where most people lived in the countryside of medieval times and living a kind of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month existence in some quite challenging circumstances. We see the early modern times don't change that much, although in towns they are changing, and for richer people we see quite rapid changes. But then the big changes happen in industrial Britain, where certainly at the start of this era things get really bad for people that are living in the working class areas of these cities like Birmingham and Manchester. And then we've thought about how things have changed in the last 120 years. Not a simple story of things always getting better, although overall you'd probably much rather live in this era in terms of living conditions than in any of the earlier ones. Here I'm just going to show you, if this helps, if you want to have a look at it, some of the kinds of questions that you could get asked to do with living conditions. So remember, these are the types of questions we have. It starts off with a kind of 1-mark question where you're asked to give an example of something. So you could be asked, give an example of a way people got rid of waste in industrial towns in the 18th century. And the way you answer that is with 1 word or a short sentence that answers the question. Just have to be really careful sometimes when you read the question, because sometimes it throws in a little kind of trick. So this question asks about the 18th century. So we're talking about 1750 to 1800 essentially. So we're not going to talk there about some of the kind of the sewer systems which get built at the end of the industrial era. You could get asked to write a clear and organized summary that analyzes living conditions in any of the eras. For example, you could get asked Britain since 1900 or medieval Britain. So there you're thinking about the main points. You're thinking about why things happened, what the consequences were. You're thinking about how different people, rich, poor, towns, countryside, experienced living conditions. The why questions are quite common for living conditions, why things got better or why things didn't improve or why things were bad for people. So this question, for example, why were living conditions in the Middle Ages dangerous for people's health? Just remember, with this question, you're trying not to just describe things. You're not telling what things were like. You're really explaining why that was dangerous for people's health. Middle Ages, of course, remember, is another way of saying medieval times. And then finally, you could get asked an essay question, how far do you agree statements? And most typically, that's going to ask you to compare living conditions between 2 eras. How far do you agree things got better, or things didn't change, or things were worse from one era to the next? So let's just look at this example. It says, how far do you agree that living conditions in towns during the early modern period were no better than during the Middle Ages? Just be really careful to read the question carefully a few times, underline keywords, and just double check you're really clear about what it's asking you to do. So this is asking you to compare the early modern and the medieval, Middle Ages era. It's asking you whether you agree that it was no better. So that means it wasn't better really in early modern compared to Middle Ages. And then it talks about towns specifically. So some people in this kind of question just rush in and start talking about living conditions and talk about things in the countryside, and you can only pick up marks if you're answering directly what the question is asking. So just be really careful to read over and check a number of times. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. Well done. Good luck with your revision.